Steps to productive soil. To many people, the soil is kind of a mystery, and they have ideas of what to do and square foot gardening and this and that, and they put the stuff on and then they kind of cross their fingers and hope it'll work. So we want to know when we plant something, it's going to produce like this, okay? And I must say, most of this, the credit for this was taken back in the 90s at Eden Valley Institute, one of our training programs. And I must say, most of the credit for this would be to my brother Joel, because he did this organic soil building program for years before I showed up there at Eden Valley. And of course, he would say that the major credit goes to God, because it says in Christ's Object Lesson that our part in spiritual things and in other things is so small compared to God's part, which is so big you can't even compare to it. See, so the sun, the soil, the microbes, the subatomic particles, he's got them all going right. And we just need to know how to cooperate. And the better you are at cooperating, the better garden you're going to have, see. Yeah. And here's a quote that really challenges me from Fundamentals of Christian Education that says, "False witness has been born in condemning land, which, if properly worked, would yield rich returns." That's what we want. When you're picking stuff out of your garden, you want your kids to feel, wow, we're rich. This is God's prosperity plan. Okay, you may not have very much money, but true riches, you can feel it. Say, wow, look at all the peppers on one plant, The narrow plans, the little strength put forth, the little study, that's what we're going to do today, as to the best methods, call loudly for reform. There's some parts of my garden calling loudly for reform, okay? And people say, oh, that's too hard. Oh, what you're sharing is too complicated, Steve. Well, we want the best methods, okay? But what I'm going to try to share with you is the full spectrum of maybe more simple and then what you can do as you get into it, okay? People need to learn that patient labor will do wonders. It's work, I'll tell you, to build the soil. There is much mourning over unproductive soil when, if men would read the Old Testament scriptures, they would see that the Lord knew much better than they in regard to the treatment of the land. And then it goes on to talk about resting the land. I guess you just read that last part there in part of Joel's presentation. Now that's kind of a rebuking statement, that one we just read, okay? Call loudly for reform. But this is a really encouraging one from Volume 6 of the Testimonies, 178. We should work the soil cheerfully, hopefully, gratefully, believing that the earth holds in her bosom rich stores for the faithful worker to garner, stores richer than gold or silver. And then there's a few dots in there. With proper, intelligent cultivation, the earth will yield its treasures for the benefit of man. The mountains and the hills are changing. The earth is waxing old like a garment, but the blessing of God, which spreads a table for his people in the wilderness, will never cease. Boy, those are the kind of statements you just want to get together and just have them when you're trying to move out and make the land produce and all. You need all the encouragement you can get. And so we want the land to really, we want to know how to really make the land produce, cooperate with God, and reap those treasures, richer than gold or silver. And as Joel probably told you, our family growing up, we were part of the Great Advent movement before my parents ever became Seventh-day Adventists. My dad kind of followed the cloud, which meant every 2 to 4 years we were moving. We had to have a garden. We always rented, land, or rented a house, and it had to have land for a garden. That was much more important than the amenities of the house, was that it had a place for a garden. And my parents had grown up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and they knew what it took to get the land tuned up fast. And we went and we found some source of manure. We put it on there because it had to produce that year. It wasn't, of course, it takes time for soil to really build up and it really to become, a good textured, loamy soil, okay? But so we learned just, it was almost prenatal influences what it took to get the soil from point A to point B. Yeah, we were out there digging that stuff out of the chicken barn or whatever. Here's the steps to productive soil. Many people want me to come look at their garden, diagnose their garden's problem. Just walking over their garden, the first thing I would say is you need massive amounts of organic matter. So today I'm just kind of imagining I'm touring your garden, and that's probably the first thing I would say, okay? Just the feel of the soil under your feet. When you spade it up and feel it, does it feel crumbly and loamy? If it doesn't, it needs massive amounts of organic matter. Of course, you can test the soil. We're going to talk about that. And one of the things on a good test, it'll tell you the percent organic matter. And Neil Kinsey, the one that I usually use for soil testing, he says if your organic matter isn't above 2.5%, your microbes are on a starvation diet. And they're really the unpaid workers that make everything work like it should in the soil. And of course, it's hard to know which one of these should be number one and number two and all, but balance the nutrients, it should be right up there. Proper tillage, so it's good aeration and the roots can go deep. Then manage nitrogen, that goes along with the nutrients, but it's something to really think about separately. Grow a green manure to just, again, stimulate the microbes, that fresh green matter. Of course, a green manure, just green plants that you grow to till in to take the place of manure. You might say green manure, okay? And of course, organic matter, just so we know what our terms are here, is anything that came from a plant or an animal. Okay, there's more technical definitions, but that works for me. So that could be oak leaves, lettuce leaves, horse manure, anything like that. And as it breaks down into what we call humus. It's a brown, spongy material that makes everything work better in the soil. And then, of course, you've already talked about resting the land, and, of course, prayer. That should be right up at the top, right? Before, after, in between type of thing.
Amen.
Okay, here's a little bit about organic matter. And when we say organic matter, we're kind of, putting organic matter and the end product, which is humus, and all the good things it does in the soil, kind of lumping it all together. It improves the soil structure. If you have a clay soil that just packs, it'll loosen it up and make it more crumbly, okay, and so forth. And then if you have sandy soil, it will help it to bind it more and help it to hold more water, okay? And it'll actually make the clay soil, so it, because of making it more pore space in there, actually better drainage and aeration. And of course it feeds the microbes, and they break the organic matter down into stable humus, which is like a bank account for your plants. It holds the nutrients available to the plants, but relatively so it won't be leached out. Most of the time we just think, oh, there's kind of like a nutrient soup down there in the soil, and the plants, when they need something, they just take a sip. Well, there is a nutrient solution in the soil, but the major way that the nutrients are held is by this attraction to the soil particles. The soil particles have a negative charge, and the nutrients, the nutrients like calcium, magnesium, and so forth that will raise your pH, they have a positive charge, and so they're held there, protected from leaching, but when your plants need it, they exchange it with the plant. The plant exchanges with the soil particles for some nutrients. So the humus is great stuff. The more humus you have in your soil, the more holding capacity your soil has, along with the clay also has that same holding capacity. And of course, the middle one there, source of plant nutrients. As the organic matter breaks down, all those nutrients that were in those plants or whatever breaks down and is released to the next generation of plants. Okay, here's source of organic matter. The easiest one is your crop residues, okay? Don't throw them in the dumpster. burn them, whatever. No, till them in, recycle them if they're too, they're going to be too rough and you want to prepare a carrot bed. Well, take that organic matter, put it in the compost pile. Always recycle it, okay? Green manures, again, you grow it right in place and till it in. Just be careful it doesn't get too big or you can have a hard time tilling it in. Of course, weeds, they're free organic matter. Just don't let them go to seed, okay? Till them in or compost them. Of course, compost is really great because it's sort of like pre-digested organic matter. And so it has a lot of available nutrients. So it's feeding your plants with nutrition and building the long-term organic percentage in your soil at the same time. So when we say compost, that could be composted manure, or actually this afternoon my son will be telling you about how to make vegetarian compost. Okay, 'cause we usually think of compost as just composted manure. You don't have to, because I'm trying to get away from some of those, dealing with some of that animal products. And so we'll tell you all about that this afternoon. And then, of course, manure, best if composted. Hay, just be careful about weed seeds. But to be honest, a lot of parts of my garden have so many weed seeds in them already that a few more weed seeds. But I use many times hay and straw as a mulch. And then over the season, it breaks down. In the fall, I till it in. And by the next year, it's all broken down. It's not going to cause me a problem there. Straw, same thing. And just remember, straw is quite low in nitrogen, so if you just tilled it into your soil, it could tie up the nitrogen. If you use it as a mulch, it'll break down over time, or use it in your compost pile. Leaves are great as a mulch, okay, or sheet composted, whereas if you're really in a aggressive soil building mode, to get all this done with composting, sometimes we never have enough compost. So you just spread, like Joel was telling, just spread those materials out, say in the fall, till them in, and by the next spring, they've pretty well broken down. When you till for your spring tillage, it turns into good, fine organic material in there. Leaf mold, that's another thing you can use, especially in a small garden. But just remember, it's low in pH, low in nitrogen, so you may need something to balance it out, okay? Just like in the compost pile, you mix materials. And one time in Alabama, I found this big pile of sawdust, okay? Very low in nitrogen. If you put very much sawdust on your garden, it will just soak up the nitrogen. So, but it was very good, long-term, stable organic matter. So I took that big mountain of sawdust and I spread it over about a half an acre of soil in the fall, garden in the fall, and I maybe put it on 2 inches thick, and then I put on a half an inch of chicken manure, which is very high in nitrogen. I tilled the whole thing in, planted a rye cover crop. Looking out there during the winter, I saw, wow, that cover crop looks pretty nice and green, not a lot of yellow leaves like in purple, like it's just struggling, So that was sort of my nitrogen test. I got the nitrogen about right, so that there's still some there after the sawdust soaked it all up. And so you just always want to keep that in mind when you're putting on organic matter, and we'll talk about that on here. Kitchen scraps, they're kind of gloppy, so they're best composted, but in Alabama they had a rule against piles of what they call garbage, and so we just dug the kitchen scraps into the garden, and it was very sandy there, so that worked pretty well. In a heavier clay soil, it can be so wet, and there's not enough air down in there to break down the garbage, just kind of, Okay, and then food processing waste. In the United States and all over the developed world, and all over the world, there's just organic matter that's just being wasted. Down in Alabama, Tom's Peanuts, we got all these truckloads of peanut hulls. In Belize, sugarcane waste, soybean pulp from making tofu, rice hulls in Dominican Republic. Wherever you go, you just, we have this reticular activating system somewhere in our brain, and it's to keep you from, getting distracted by the frog in the ditch instead of focusing on the driving or whatever. So you tune out the billboards, okay, and you tune in the organic matter. Suddenly you see, wow, all these organic resources, and you just ask about them, share a few cantaloupes with those people at the end of the season or something. And it's really a great, witnessing thing, yeah. Okay, and here it kind of gives you this idea of what are the high nitrogen materials. They're kind of like low nitrogen materials, They're kind of the straw, woody, brown, straw-like materials like straw, sawdust. I usually wouldn't use sawdust or recommend it. Leaves, corn stalks, we could put those on there, probably 80-1. And that first number is the carbon, okay? And then the last number is always a 1. So if you see a big number like 400, it means very low in nitrogen and very high in carbon. And then if you see numbers like this, it's higher in nitrogen because the carbon numbers are smaller. Clover, 15-1. Manure can be actually anywhere from 7-1 on chicken manure up to 20-1 maybe on cow manure. And then a lot of times, you go to a horse farm to get manure, and it's all mixed with wood shavings, so it's probably closer to 30 to 40-1 maybe. But most of the time you just pile that up and it makes a wonderful compost pile because it starts heating up. And so, it's already mixed material for you. But you just get that in your head. Green materials, high in nitrogen, or if it's from protein, like some beans or something like that. Joel's used a lot of bean splits from a place there in Colorado that was near Monument Valley. An excellent nitrogen fertilizer source because central to the protein molecule is a nitrogen. And then, of course, anything that comes from an animal seems to be high in nitrogen. So you just want to keep that in mind so you don't make these common mistakes that people make when they're they read these organic books, and they get all excited about building their organic matter, and they add large amounts of low nitrogen organic matter to the soil without balancing it with high nitrogen materials. And when I was at Uchee Pines, people would they'd be reading these books, and they'd put all this wood shavings and sawdust, and we had a lot of pine needles and stuff there, and they'd till that all into their bed. Boy, their beds felt like the Garden of Eden soil, just all so puffy and everything, but it soaked up all the nitrogen. They'd plant their tomatoes, and they'd turn all yellow because they didn't have any nitrogen, and then they start getting black spots. Opportunistic, fungus was now just on those leaves that were dying anyway. And so they come to me, oh, Steve, I've got a terrible disease. What do I do? So after a while, I didn't even have to go look at their garden. I just say, well, you went and you're reading those books, right? Yeah, of course, I believe in those organic books, but they didn't read the whole book maybe or something. And I'd say, yeah, and you put that all in your soil and this and this. I said, well, just go get some nitrogen, put it on there. Could be chemical fertilizer, but I'd recommend organic fertilizer, alfalfa meal or pellets or soybean meal or something like that, and just dig a little trench around there and do some rescue chemistry, Get some Peters fertilizer. Yeah, that's the ultimate chemical fertilizer. And resurrect your tomato plants. See, they were dying of disease, not because of disease, but because so little nitrogen. So if you know that caution, it'll save you a lot of trouble. And then, of course, just a practical thing of another mistake, adding large amounts of rough organic material just before you plant. If you're trying to plant carrots and, this trashy stuff, so that's not the time to try to put in a lot of rough stuff. It'll tie up your nutrients like nitrogen, and it'll just interfere with planting there. Okay, this chart can kind of give you an idea. You're saying, well, what is the real idea here? Okay, how do I picture this? How much to put on or something? And, of course, there's so many different materials that you could use that, but this kind of just gives you an idea, okay? And this comes out of Elliot Coleman's book, New Organic Grower. It's kind of for market gardeners, but he also has another one called 4-Season Harvest, which is for more like home gardeners, and also it tells you how to grow salads year-round in a cold frame or whatever, which I'll be talking about this afternoon. So here, if your soil is, low in fertility, you could think a good application would be 40 tons to the acre, and then if you're doing it on a garden scale, 1,000 square feet or 100 square feet. Some of us are just doing a postage stamp garden, aren't we? Okay, so 1 ton, how would you picture that? Of compost might be or rotted manure or whatever, might be a pickup load, okay? And then 200 pounds for 100 square feet would be maybe 2 wheelbarrows full, okay? Because I just have to simplify it down for my brain, okay? And then this was kind of a recipe type thing, which is okay, but if you really want to make sure that you're putting on what your soil really needs instead of putting on something that it doesn't need, or even putting on nutrients that it already has too much of, you really need to do a soil test, okay? But this is kind of a shotgun approach, or a rule of thumb, of what you could do if you didn't have maybe a soil test. And then here is just what you might do as a maintenance application, year by year of the compost. And you see down here the fine print underneath, which you always want to read. The fine print says you don't necessarily have to put that rock phosphate to supply the phosphorus. If your soil indicates that you already have enough phosphorus or potassium, if it has plenty of potassium, you wouldn't need to put the green sand, because that's a source of potassium. And of course, to know how much lime to put on to adjust your pH, you really need to do a soil test, okay? And then put the lime on according to the soil test. Most soil tests, though, that you get from just maybe Extension Service or university, they'll tell you nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's the big 3 nutrients that most people know about, okay? And then pH. But there's many other nutrients that your plant needs, okay? It needs boron, zinc, iron, copper, and of course it needs calcium, magnesium, all those. And so I really encourage people to get a more in-depth soil test that will help you to really balance the nutrients in your soil, because the soil works a lot better if it has a certain balance of nutrients rather than just a simplistic soil test that tells you the pH and the NPK, okay? But when I was 10 years old, my gardening teacher gave me a rule of thumb, which I've used a lot. It kind of goes along with this, and that is, if you're growing a crop that has big leafy green leaves like corn or cabbage, broccoli, or something like that, you want to make sure it has plenty of nitrogen, okay? Because that's what is very important to have green. If it's yellow, it means it doesn't have enough nitrogen usually. And so nitrogen for things that big, green, leafy. And then potassium for, phosphorus for things you want to grow sweet fruits like tomatoes or what. Many times we put some rock phosphate in the hole and mix it in with the compost when we plant our tomatoes to help it to be earlier. And phosphorus, if you study cell biology or whatever, it's what moves the sugar around in the cell is ADP and ATP, okay? Adenosine triphosphate, okay? So that is, if you want to have sweet fruits and vegetables, you want your kids to really like those beets, then you want to, and then the potassium, you want to emphasize potassium for your root crops. That would be like carrots, beets, potatoes, those kind of things. And so if you just kind of use that rule of thumb in the back of your mind whenever you're planting that kind of thing, you just make sure that, you know, that particular part of your garden has adequate of that. And of course the soil test helps you to know for sure that you have done your homework, you might say. Okay, then this is the number 2 point in our steps to productive soil. We built the organic matter. That's just kind of like the foundation that makes everything else work better. It makes whatever nutrients are there much more available to the plants, because the microbes produce these chelating agents, which are just big sugars that hook on to especially the trace elements. Many times they might be there in the soil, but they have a hard time getting into the plant. And so these chelates come up to the root of the plant, up to the door of the plant, you might say. They ring the doorbell. The plant opens the door for the chelate, and the chelate just takes that zinc or whatever that would ordinarily be locked up in the soil, makes it available to the plant. So organic matter makes everything work better. And then you're ready to start figuring out, okay, what do I need to put on my soil so it has, as far as nutrition, everything it needs. Some people are all about nutrition. University people are all about putting on the chemistry, okay, the nutrients here. But they don't emphasize the organic part. But the organic people many times are just emphasizing organic matter. You just blindly put on these organic materials and you just live happily ever after, okay? But if you do both, you make sure there's plenty of organic matter to be the food for the microbes and the power for the soil, energy for the soil, and you put the nutrients there, then you're really in the driver's seat, okay? And kind of soil test that I recommend is what's called a CEC soil test, which stands for cation exchange capacity. And that is those are the positively charged nutrients like calcium, magnesium, potassium, actually sodium is one of those too. And those are all the ones that raise your pH, okay? And this is the balance that you want to have. Most soil tests is just sufficient to get you through the growing season, okay? But what you're wanting to do is to sort of fill up this bank account with a certain, or this bucket. The CEC is like how big a bucket your soil has, or how big a vault in the bank it has to hold nutrients. And you want this filled up with a certain balance of nutrients, which you see here. Yeah, it's not a cation, it's an anion, okay? And it's held more in the soil in association with the nitrogen, with the organic matter, which I've been telling about. But when you're dealing with this, balancing this cation exchange capacity of the soil, you're dealing with those potassium, calcium, magnesium, and also the percent hydrogen is just what is the pH, okay? And many people think of, okay, well, just get the pH right, and that's what the soil test is, a little cheap soil test you get from the Extension Service. Oh, your pH is about, it should be about, 6.5 to 6.8. Oh, it's right there. That's fine, 6.7. Okay, well, don't even worry about putting on any lime. But actually, the pH might be up real high because of a lot of potassium in your soil. Your soil may have way too much potassium, but not enough calcium. So your cucumbers will taste bitter, okay? And your watermelons, if it's a little dry, they'll just shrivel on the end because they don't have enough calcium, okay? And different things like that. So Neil Kinsey, what he'll tell you, and you see this in human health many times, is if you get the balance of these nutrients, the pH will end up right there where it's supposed to be, okay? But sometimes you need to just ignore the pH and say, hey, we need some calcium there because it's way low, and that's the king of the nutrient or whatever, queen of the nutrients. And so different soils have different exchange capacity. A sandy soil is very low capacity, okay? A 7 ME, we measure it by that. And a clay soil, and it has a lot of clay and humus in it, has a big capacity to hold, so you have to put a lot more in to fill it up so and so much, okay? And so you need somebody doing your soil test who has a certain level of sophistication, can kind of, you don't even need to remember most of the stuff I'm telling you. You just find the right person to do your soil test. You send that soil off to them. They do all the number crunching and all the brain work, and they tell you exactly what you need to put on your soil to have the best nutrient quality, okay, and the best disease resistance and the best yield, okay? And so it's very, very important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, especially the health part, okay? Okay, so here you can see maybe on the right would be sandy soil. Might have only a 12 mil equivalent capacity. And so it takes just a little bit of lime to get it from a pH of 5.5 to 6 or whatever, 6.5, 6.8. But over here on the left, the clay soil has a big capacity. And so to change its pH, it takes more. So you're dealing with the capacity there. You just picture that. Okay, now we're going to talk about taking the soil sample, because that's very important. That is your part to do. Okay? And if you don't do that right, all the money you spend on this soil test would be wasted. You want to use a clean container, clean tools, okay? Because, and you want to be careful not to handle it, because, if you have sweat on your hands, that's sodium, that'll throw this whole thing off, okay? And peanut butter, that's nitrogen, okay, and other nutrients. Okay, and I usually put a plastic bag into the bucket just to make sure, and I put it in the plastic bag, see. So it's really clean, and you sample to the average tilling depth, which is about 7 inches, or whatever's recommended by the lab, because they're figuring on, how much it's going to take to make the right parts per million in that plow layer or whatever. And you want to take 10 to 20 probes in just a random thing back through across your garden, and you want to stay away from anything that is different, where there's been a compost pile of lime, fence rows, where you had maybe squash and melon hills, and you put a whole bunch of compost under that. Well, you just stay away from that. You want it to be really a true picture of the general soil that needs to be improved, okay? And then you mix that thoroughly, and I just take that bag out of the bucket, and I just roll it around and munch the lumps through the bag, and so I don't even have to touch it, okay? And then I send 1 cup to the lab. Some labs, 2 cups, but Neil Kinsey, he only needs one cup. And here we're taking the sample with a professional soil probe. This was at Eden Valley Institute. But this is what I do a lot of times, is I dig it up with a clean shovel, okay? Make a nice hole, and then I just slice down the side of the hole. And then I make a butter stick, okay? You see I'm cutting that with a stainless steel knife I borrowed from my wife's kitchen. And you don't want to take a lot of the trash from the top, okay? Because that might be, I just kind of scrape that off, because a rabbit might have, come hopping through there just before I was taking this or something. And that's why you want to take multiple samples, so if there's something different, it'll sort of average out. Okay, here's another way you can do it. Dig the hole and then just scrape with a spoon up the side. Okay, and again, then you just throw it in your bucket. You never have to touch it, type of thing. Okay, and here's what you'll get back, a report like this, and it just tells you, how much, let's say right here on phosphates, how much you have, the value found, and how much you need. Well, here on this thing from Colorado, I think, we actually had more phosphorus than we needed. So they're not recommending any rock phosphate or any phosphorus, but something most people don't even think about is sulfur. Put sulfur on your soil. Plants need sulfur, and many times they're deficient and not as resistant to disease, or not as productive because of not enough sulfur. And here for nitrogen, it tells you, if you tell them you're doing it for a garden, they'll tell you recommendation for 1,000 square feet instead of for the acre. Otherwise, you get it for acre, and then you have to divide it by, 40. There's 43,000 square feet an acre, so you divide it by 40 or 43 to get per 1,000 square feet. But if you're doing it in a garden level, you just tell them that, and they'll tell you exactly how much to put on, so it's not very complicated or anything. You let them do all the complicated stuff. And here it tells the exchange capacity of your soil. It tells you the balance there is between calcium and magnesium. That's the most important ratio between the two. Tells you the pH, tells you the humus content. Hey, this is pretty good. 4%. Down in Alabama, where it's hot and sandy, it just burns up the organic matter. I was just happy if I could get 3% organic matter. But further north in a heavier soil, you can get 4, 5, 6% organic matter is a good. And then this is what you're really interested in, is this right here, not the actual pounds per acre, but the percentage of the cation exchange capacity that's filled up with calcium, the percentage that's filled up with magnesium, and so on and so forth. And they calculate that all, and then they give you exactly what to put on. And here's what you should put on for this was high calcium lime, and then this was Dolomite lime. That's a kind of lime that has magnesium in it. If you go down to the garden center and say, I want lime, they'll give you Dolomite lime. Okay, they don't know anything about this. And so your soil might already have plenty of magnesium, and you're putting even more on. That'll make your clay soil even more sticky, okay? And it takes more nitrogen to produce the same crop of corn. But they're back in the dark ages, see? And so you say, no, I want high calcium lime, okay? And you get on the phone, make those 5 phone calls to find what you don't, find those weird organic farmers, and they'll tell you where to find this kind of stuff, okay? And then down here, the trace elements. That's very important. And on this soil, all we needed was 7.25 ounces of borax. And you can get that from Walmart, 20 mule team borax. It's just a white powder. And you just need to mix it with sand so that you can spread it, because that's not very much to spread over 1,000 square feet. And you spread half of it this direction, and you spread half of it this direction to really get, an even spread. Okay, and here's just another example. This one needed more trace elements. Boy, I don't know what's happening to my light here. Down at the bottom there, you can see it tells you again exactly what you need of copper. This one needed copper and iron and boron, but no zinc and no manganese. And I can tell you from testing soil really all over the world that just about every soil you'll find it has at least one or two trace elements that are very deficient. Okay? And so that's very important for health, If you go to the health food store and looking for boron, what will you be seeing there on the pill bottle? What does it usually say, boron? What does it have to do with in your health? It's usually things like osteotrace, okay? It's for joint problems, joint pains, okay? Well, put it on your soil, then it'll go into the plants. It's a much nicer way to eat your boron than in those, pills.
A lot of those are synthetics as well. They have
that's true.
Synthetic manures, synthetic aminos.
Yeah, and some of them just go right through you because they're just Dolomite lime, okay? And it doesn't absorb very well anyway, so it's just a Walmart pill. And then iron is very important with taking the other nutrients in. And copper is very important for strengthening the smooth muscle, like of the aorta, to protect you against aortic aneurysms. It's the kind of thing where you're just gone. It blew out. See? So you want to get it through the soil. You're doing all this work in your garden, say, so you want it to really count. And I must tell you, this Neil Kinsey soil test, it does cost a little bit of money, okay? But even if you're doing a relatively small backyard garden, I would say, so many things we spend money on. You look back the last year or maybe the last even month that you spent money on, and so it costs $50 for a soil test. For me, that's a tank of gas. And so it's well worth it if you think of all the work that you put into your garden and how valuable your health or the health of your children are. Yeah. And then here you were asking about the nitrogen. Okay, they're the anions, okay, which are phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, and this is just telling you that actually in this test and most soil tests, they don't actually measure the nitrogen because it can change. A big thunderstorm comes and the nitrogen level changes in your soil overnight, say. And so they go by estimated nitrogen release, which is based on your organic matter. If you have a lot of organic matter in your soil, as it breaks down over the season, the nitrogen that was in that organic matter is released to your plants. So the more organic matter you have, unless you just dumped on a bunch of sawdust, and that's your only organic matter, but relatively good organic matter and humus, as it breaks down, it's releasing that nitrogen. The more organic matter you have, the more it's just automatically feeding. You're not having to be out there just spoon feeding your plants. Many gardeners, that's what they're doing. See, the soil is just to hold the plants up while they put on the, chemical fertilizer, say. But what we want to do, we want to feed our soil, and then the soil will feed the plants. Even though you've already caught on that you always need to be aware of what the plants need in order to intelligently feed the soil. But it's just a different approach. Yeah. And we use natural things, not only organic matter or compost, but we use rock powders, okay? Instead of chemical fertilizer, the chemical fertilizer industry, they take hard rock phosphate, they treat it with acid and makes it into available phosphorus, okay? Well, after not too many weeks and months after you put that phosphorus fertilizer, chemical phosphorus fertilizer on your soil, most of that phosphorus locks up with the calcium in your soil and makes tricalcium phosphate, that's rock phosphate, okay? And it's even more locked up than it was in the raw rock phosphate. So what we do in a natural fertilizer idea is we put that raw rock phosphate on, and then the microbes release that because they produce mild acids, and you have your own little chemical fertilizer or natural fertilizer company right there in your soil, see? And the microbes are your unpaid workers down there doing all this for you. And so if you put on, according to the soil test, the rock phosphate that's needed, of course you may not even need, your soil may not even need phosphorus, okay? We were in Colorado, we had that granite-based soil Joel was telling you about, and that is, granite is potassium. I mean, we just had, our potassium was so high it was causing us certain weed problems and other things. So we didn't want to put on any more potassium. See, so if you're just doing this recipe that Uncle so-and-so said, oh yeah, we put green sand on every year and it makes it grow so good. Well, maybe that works back in Maine, but if you're over here where the granite is, you don't want to put in any more. See, we'll save your money. See? And so you want to do it intelligently, right? Yeah. Okay, and here's some of the trace elements. And again, you want to be real careful with the trace elements because you see here for boron, 1 part per million is excellent, and 2 parts per million is excessive or even toxic, okay? And so you want to be careful to put on just what is, recommended. And if your soil needs a lot of boron, many times Neil Kinsey will put this little thing down at the bottom that says, put it on this much every 6 months for 2 or 3 times in order to get it built up. But you'll find many soils are very low in boron, and it really affects the disease resistance of the plants and and also nutrition. I want to get through my steps to productive soil. In the next session this afternoon, we'll cover those sources. Okay. The next thing is you want to break up compaction, and with that, you don't want to just run your tiller, just 3 inches deep or whatever. You want to get in there with like the broad fork or on a tractor, get in there with some kind of subsoiler, break it up, and really do deep tillage. Good aeration, and so the roots can go deep. And of course, you want to get your amendments down in there as well. And of course, when it's all said and done with doing deep tillage, you want to then prepare a nice fine seed bed and that kind of thing. Here we're doing the broad fork in the greenhouse. And when you're putting on these amendments, you want to be careful to really incorporate them really well, okay? You wouldn't want to just put it on top of, you go out there in your backyard and you're going to spade up your grass, okay? And you put all these amendments on, then you come with your spade and you just flip that over, and all those amendments end up in the bottom, okay? So it might be better to spade up your garden ahead of time, okay? And maybe till it, let it sit for a few weeks so all that sod can break down. Then when you're doing more of your final preparation, coming in with your tiller and tilling it all up, then you put on these, lime and boron and zinc and rock phosphate, and you really mix it with full depth of what your roots are going to be going. But these broad fork or just a good spading is good to loosen it up deep. Yeah. Okay, then the other thing is you want to manage nitrogen. And I think Joel already talked about this, that if you add your nitrogen in the rotation where the nitrogen-loving crops are, and then the next year when you're planting the light feeders, which would be like carrots or potatoes or whatever, you don't add that huge amount of nitrogen. You just kind of coast, okay? And then by the next year, maybe the first year on a given bed, you planted maybe broccoli, need a lot of nitrogen. The next year, you planted carrots and beets on that same bed. And then by then, the nitrogen's getting pretty low. So then you grow a soil builder, which is a legume that will actually add nitrogen to the soil. And then you're ready to go back and plant corn in that bed again. Okay, so that's kind of a 3-year rotation you might have. But that way you will get the most bang for your buck with nitrogen, which is usually the hardest one to always have it there. Okay, and then this is the one I wanted to get to, is that, many times I don't have enough compost to go around to everything, so I use in-row type of nitrogen, natural nitrogen fertilizer, like alfalfa pellets or soybean meal or something like that. And you can get these, if you look for them, you can find organic alfalfa meal or organic alfalfa pellets. You can just till this into your bed, or you can put it right beside the road, just like you would chemical fertilizer. That's why people like that. You can just get it out of a bag and just sprinkle it down there. It's such a nice, sanitized way to garden instead of all this yucky compost stuff. See? And so it's nice to, even where you see, I didn't quite get everything done last fall to build the organic matter and everything, or I didn't hit the nitrogen level just right, so you can side dress while your plants are growing. You can, I take one of those push planters, and where the seed hopper is, I just put the soybean meal in there, and I just plant that soybean meal right down beside my row, okay? And that will, give the plants the boost they need, maybe. But most of the time, alfalfa pellets, I use that. Here's my bed. Let's say this is my bed. I just sprinkle those alfalfa pellets on there, and then I till it in. And unless it's maybe something like beans that tend to rot in the soil or something, most of the time alfalfa pellets will not rot your seeds. Okay? Or you can put a handful of alfalfa pellets in when you're transplanting your tomatoes. Maybe you want to plant them real early in the spring. The soil's cold. It doesn't do a good job then of releasing nitrogen for the plants. So you just give them that little nitrogen boost, so that way the plants won't just sit there. It's real cold and they turn all colors of yellow and purple and take about 2 weeks to decide they're going to take off and grow. You've lost all that time, see? And so if you give them a little extra nitrogen there, they'll just take off and grow, but you're not giving them so much. If you give things like tomato plants too much nitrogen, you'll have a big bush, okay, and you'll be looking for the blossoms and the fruit. See? So you want to be careful you don't give too much, just enough to get them off and running, and then whatever, usually I'm putting compost in the hole too. The compost will carry it the rest of the way through the season of giving it long-term nutrition without giving it too much available nitrogen all at once. So this just, kind of gives you an idea of how much to the acre and how much per 100 square feet, okay, or 100 foot of row. And then here's soybean meal. One caution is now both soybeans and now alfalfa are GMO, okay? So you want to get organic soybean meal or organic alfalfa meal. So you look for some organic supplier for that, and many times you'd be surprised, not that much more expensive. But just a caution, the soybean meal, that's a bean, and as it breaks down in the soil, it can rot your beans or other seeds. So that one I wouldn't just spread over the bed like this unless I'm going to give time for it to be tilled in and break down for a while. I wouldn't just sprinkle it on and then plant right away like I would with alfalfa pellets. I would put it beside the row. Okay, so a lot of times I'll mark my rows for my corn, and if I think I need some extra nitrogen beyond my broadcast thing that I did from my soil test, I'll just mark my rows, and then I just take my push planter again with soybean meal or alfalfa meal, and I just plant a row of nitrogen fertilizer right beside my row where I'm going to plant my corn. Then I plant the corn, and it's got it right there. Okay. And then growing a green manure really stimulates the microbes, and we could spend a whole hour talking about green manures, but we're running out of time on that, so we'll just let you take a picture of it. And okay. And then, of course, resting the land, I already talked about that. And I've done testing to where I rested the land and where I didn't rest the land, soil testing, and it came out that the nutrient levels where I'd rested the land were higher. So God's just telling you, without telling you all the chemistry and everything, hey, when you plant the seed, I want you to have a really good crop. So just give the soil, just like people need a rest, give the soil a rest so those nutrients can build up in the soil so you really have a super crop. Okay, and then here's a verse from the Bible that really highlights the need to pray, that God will, again, He's doing the big part. We're just cooperating with Him. If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and will heal their land. So we need to pray that God will teach us how to be good cooperators with Him. Okay, I guess we pretty well used up the time, but maybe there's somebody has a question here. Yeah. Yeah, good question. The question is, what happens to the soil that's fertilized with chemical fertilizer? Well, if you put chemical fertilizer on your soil, it's not necessarily poisoned, okay? It's the same chemistry that, is in there already. It's an easy thing to put too much on, okay? And it's just like with human nutrition, okay? It's best to eat a variety of natural foods rather than to take concentrated pills, which could give you imbalances in nutrition. So it's the same thing. It's very easy to put too much nitrogen, okay, which actually overstimulates the microbes, and they always want a balanced diet between carbon and nitrogen. So if they get too much nitrogen, they go looking for some carbon to go with the nitrogen, and guess what will happen? They will go and burn up more organic matter. Okay, and actually then that as they burn up that humus, it releases all the micronutrients that are in the humus. So you grow a beautiful crop with that NPK fertilizer. But the next year, you've burned up some of your bank account, and it takes even more chemical fertilizer to do it, and that burns up more humus. Okay, and so it's a vicious cycle that you are getting less and less response out of more and more. It's so that's only one little example of, hey, just try to cooperate with the natural system instead of come in and override it type of thing. Yeah.
Are there books and DVDs that will remind us of all these details that are hard to write down at the speed of light?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, here's a sales job for my book, which is back there on the Thy Word Creations table, and it says Eden Valley Seminar Handbook, and it has 10 DVDs with it. So if you're interested in that. And then over on the Ad Agra table, they have some really good ones there. The one by Elliot Coleman, 4-Season Harvest, is, I would say, very good. It's a cutting edge, but in very simple terms. Yeah, you can over-till, maybe like Joel was saying, over-whiz your soil, okay? You're trying to develop a texture by just whizzing it. Well, the texture is going to be improved by adding organic matter. And you can use a rototiller to incorporate the organic matter, okay? But it's a necessary evil, he might say. So don't be afraid of tilling your soil, but don't just till it to death. You just think of what you can do to get the job done. And this afternoon, I'm going to continue here. First, my son will give you the whole thing about how to do vegetarian compost. And then I'll show you a series of slides of, we just took a bed and we did it by hand, digging it up and adding the amendments and the compost, so you can kind of, again, you can picture, oh yeah, because if I see something, then, oh, I can do that, yeah. That's how all that complicated stuff works. So that we're going to do this. Well, yeah, I mean, tillage is also to prepare a seed bed, okay? But many times I try to do the deep tillage maybe in the fall, because then it's usually nice and dry. Don't be afraid to do it in the spring. But then it's already done. See, you even form your beds and everything, and then you just go out there and plant your early salad mix, and you're not trying to, when it's too wet, do some super tillage type of thing. So you kind of have to work with the cycles of weather and nature type of thing. Yes.
On the way up,
Yeah, at the bottom of this that I had up here that kind of walked you through his soil test, it gives his address there. Yeah, and I think they have his books back here at the Ad Agra table. Yeah, but if you just Google Kinsey Agricultural Services or Kinsey Ag, it'll come up there, and you can download the form, and he has a whole page there, how to take a soil test, and so forth. Yeah, that's a good question. If you do this test, you only have to do this like once every 3 to 5 years, okay? In fact, you don't want to come back and test it again before 3 years. Otherwise, you'll have to tell him what you'd put on so recently, because that will throw the test off. Okay, so you put that all on, and these are rock powders and so forth. So they'll take several years, 3 years to release. And so you don't even want to test again before then. And like I said, though, many times they'll give you things that you need to do over time to get your soil up to where it should be. So you're not getting 1 year's recommendation. You're getting maybe 2 years recommendation. And if you don't understand something on the soil test, you just call up their office, okay, and pester them and say, well, I can't find this, or this is too expensive. Isn't there some way I can just put on enough to this year? And then, of course, that's when you're doing it by the acre. But we've done that, okay? Oh, yeah, you can cut that boron in half, and then you can put the rest of it on next year or whatever. So you've got some advice on the other end. And, hey, when you're paying $50, man, I want to squeeze all the benefit out of it that I can. You know? And that's the way you get educated, see? Because when you get that test, there'll be so many things. Well, I thought that if it had this much, they would only recommend this. They wouldn't recommend both calcium and magnesium. And so you call them up and say, well, why are you doing this? And then they'll tell you, well, when you put on more calcium, it sweeps some of the magnesium under the rug, and so you need more magnesium. Well, who cares? You guys take care of that. Sure, I'll just put on what you said. But they'll educate you, you know. Yeah. See, if you're starting on raw land, you can just do a rule of thumb and put on like that chart, 40 tons of the acre of this and this. But again, you may be even messing up your soil. Don't be afraid to grow a garden without a soil test. We fear you might mess it up. But before you do anything, that's the best time to do it, okay? Joel went to Monument Valley, and he started putting on sheep manure that they'd rounded up there in their sheep pens, and it was causing him all kinds of problems because of what? Sodium, potassium. And so he sent a test to Neil Kinsey, and Neil Kinsey said, yeah, don't put that on. And he had all those bean splits, and Neil Kinsey said, that's the exact thing your soil needs. And he had so much of it free. And so he just put that on. His soil was so good. All it needed was just a little bit of trace elements. And it was so great. But by doing it blindly, he was causing himself so much problems. He had to even scrape some of the soil off as a problem. And just by doing that test, it put him right in the driver's seat type of thing. Okay, maybe we should wind up here. If you have any more questions, we'll be glad to answer them. And, of course, we're going to do the rest of this soil thing this afternoon, so we'll have more time for questions. Yeah.